Picture this. It's the 1960s, and a wave of change is sweeping across Africa. Colonial flags are coming down, and brand new ones are rising in their place. It was this incredible time of hope, of dreams of self-determination, but it was also a time of just immense, almost overwhelming challenges. In this explainer, we're going to dive into those turbulent and fascinating first decades of African freedom.
So, here's how we're going to break down this really complex era. We'll start with that amazing feeling, the dream of independence. Then, we'll look at the competing ideas for how to actually build a nation. We'll meet some of the key leaders who had to make these crucial choices, and we'll have to confront the lasting legacy of colonialism, that colonial ghost. And finally, we'll weigh it all out, the successes versus the challenges.
Can you just imagine the atmosphere? I mean, after generations of foreign rule, the future was finally in African hands. The mission seemed so clear: build brand new nations, forge new identities, and bring Africa into the modern era of nation-states on its own terms.
But that brings up this absolutely monumental question, one that every single new leader had to face. Okay, so you've just inherited a state that you didn't even create. How do you even begin to build a nation from that? What's the first step? What does success even look like?
You know, independence didn't mean a clean slate, not even close. New nations were handed a whole host of problems from their colonial past. You had borders just drawn on a map in Europe that lumped rival ethnic groups together, economies that were only designed to ship raw materials out, not to build any local prosperity. And the human cost, it's just staggering. At independence, the entire Congo had just three college graduates. So the task wasn't just building a nation, it was trying to do it on a deeply flawed foundation.
So, with all these challenges staring them in the face, leaders had to choose a path forward. They needed a blueprint for their new country. And believe me, there was a whole menu of competing ideas out there, each one offering a really different vision for the future.
One of the really influential ideas was African socialism. Now, this wasn't just taking European socialism and plopping it down in a new continent. No, it was an attempt to create something uniquely African. The idea was to blend socialist principles with traditional values of community and self-reliance. Basically, to create a system that wasn't based on the exploitation they saw in the West.
On the complete other side of the spectrum, you had capitalism. But for many of these new African nations, this was a total non-starter. Why? Because it was the economic system of the colonizers. It was seen as the engine of the very exploitation they had just fought so hard to escape.
Then there was democracy. I mean, on paper, a lot of new countries called themselves democracies. They aspired to its ideals, free elections, human rights, having multiple parties. But the reality on the ground was often very different. Those old colonial structures that were left behind made a real democratic transition incredibly difficult.
And this difficulty is what led many leaders to adopt the one-party state model. The argument for it was pretty compelling at the time. With all these ethnic divisions created by colonialism, a single party was seen as the only way to forge a unified national identity and stop the country from just tearing itself apart. So pluralism was often sacrificed for the goal of unity.
So when you lay it all out like this, you can really see the critical choice these new nations were facing. Each one of these ideologies offered a fundamentally different path for how you define ownership, how you distribute power, and how you forge a national identity. And the decisions they made right here, at this crossroads, would go on to define the continent for decades.
All right, now let's move from these big, abstract ideas and see how they were actually put into practice by real people on the front lines. We're going to look at 3 fascinating and very different leaders who really embody the struggles and the ambitions of this era.
First up, Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo. This quote just says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly captures his fierce, unyielding vision. He was not going to be a pawn in the Cold War. For him, his loyalty was to one thing and one thing only: a free and independent Africa.
Lumumba's goals were, frankly, revolutionary. He demanded full control over the Congo's immense mineral wealth. He championed a united country against movements that wanted to break away, and he was a powerful voice for Pan-Africanism. But this kind of bold stance, well, it put him on a direct collision course with some very powerful foreign interests, especially Belgium and the United States.
Now, let's meet Joseph Désiré Mobutu, who was the Congo's army chief. His words here give you a starkly different vision, don't they? He's using this idea of African tradition to justify a one-party state and, as it turned out, his own absolute power.
The relationship between these two men
Wow, it is one of the great tragedies of this era. Mobutu actually started out as Lumumba's protege, but in the end, he betrayed him, playing a key role in the events that led to Lumumba's assassination in 1961. And then, in this incredibly cynical twist, Mobutu seizes power, rules as a brutal dictator for 32 years, and then declares Lumumba a national hero just to try and legitimize his own regime.
Okay, let's step away from the chaos of the Congo, because far from there, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania was offering a very different path. This quote right here gets to the very heart of his philosophy, a people-centered, self-reliant way to build a nation.
Nyerere's grand experiment was a policy called ujamaa, which is Swahili for familyhood. It was formalized in the Arusha Declaration of 1967, and it was really the embodiment of African socialism. The goal was to build the nation from the ground up, by organizing people into communal villages that focused on self-reliance and rural development. And while it had some major successes, especially in literacy and national unity, the policy really struggled to boost agricultural output. It just highlights how incredibly difficult it is to implement such a radical vision.
But it didn't matter what the vision was or who the leader was. Every single new nation was haunted by what was left behind, the colonial ghost. Those deep-rooted structures and invisible chains, it continued to shape the continent's destiny long after the colonizers themselves had packed up and left. 74%. Just let that number sink in for a second. According to the Varieties of Democracy Project, between 1960 and 2020, 74% of African states experienced authoritarian rule. Now, this wasn't just an accident. It really begs the question, why? Why was this path so common? Well, the thing is, African leaders didn't inherit democratic states, not at all. They inherited these autocratic machines that were designed for control and for resource extraction. They were trying to build free nations inside the prefabricated structures of unfree ones. Those arbitrary borders fueled ethnic conflict, and weak institutions struggled to gain any public trust, which often made a strong man seem like the only option to keep the country stable.
So, after 2 decades of freedom, what was the result? Where did all this lead? The story isn't one of simple success or failure. It's a complex and mixed legacy, one that's filled with genuine triumphs and also some profound disappointments.
Let's actually look at the balance sheet. On the success side, the greatest achievement was sovereignty itself. That's huge. New national identities were forged through what was called Africanization, and there were massive investments in education and health. A real sense of Pan-African pride flourished. But the challenges were severe. Political instability, constant military coups, the rise of big man dictators, and a continued economic dependency on former colonial powers. The seeds of ethnic conflict, planted by those colonial borders, grew into devastating civil wars.
And that really brings us to our final thought here. This period wasn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living legacy. The choices that were made, the systems that were built, and the ghosts of that colonial past, they all continue to shape politics, economics, and identity across the continent today. And it leaves us with this question: how did those first turbulent decades of freedom still define Africa's path forward?